Okay, so understanding how matter is recycled is an important part to understanding the function of ecosystems, because it helps explain how the biosphere is integrated in with the other spheres, so the geosphere and the atmosphere and the hydrosphere, and how the recycling of matter between those spheres is kept stable by the interactions in the biosphere. So having a healthily functioning ecosystem with all the exchanges of interactions between the animals and plants helps stabilize on a global level the recycling of important matter such as carbon, nitrogen and water, and it makes sure that those important elements are provided in a fresh form continuously throughout hundreds of thousands of years of Earth's history. So we'll be going through the recycling of all three of those. So recycling of water, carbon and nitrogen, and they're some of the most important elements with the being able to support life on Earth. And to start with, I'd like to just go through the water cycle. So in the water cycle, what we're mostly interested in as far as biological systems go is how is the fresh water that is important for all life on Earth, how is that recycled within those spheres and kept in fresh forms available to support life. So if we look at water on Earth, 97% of all the water is in the oceans and only 3% is fresh water. And of that 3%, if we put that out on a pie graph to show the composition of different parts, 70% of that will be frozen, so it could be locked up in the poles as ice caps or frozen groundwater. 29% of what's left over is groundwater itself, so running fresh groundwater, and you can access that, and many of the breakthroughs of agricultural systems are linked with tunneling down into the ground and bringing up that fossil water. But the issues are it's a resource that is replenished over long time frames. So it might take hundreds or even thousands of years in some of the aquifers for the water to percolate through the levels of soil and get back into those aquifers and recharge them again. So one of the biggest problems with agriculture and how it's currently done is its reliance upon drawing out that groundwater and the smaller rate at which that groundwater is replenished. Particularly, one of the main problems is with the compaction of land and the clearing of trees. It doesn't allow water to percolate through the levels of the soil back into the groundwater again. So you're drawing out the groundwater, but it's not able to recharge itself. And even if it could, it would take hundreds of thousands of years to replace the amount of water that is being taken out. So we're using that resource in an unrenewable way, and it's going to have big consequences for the future of how we currently do agriculture. So the other 1% is the parts that is most readily renewable, and for creating a sustainable agricultural system, we really need to focus on replenishing, sourcing our water from this 1% of all available fresh water. So sourcing our water from that and making sure that our sourcing of it is sustainable. So we're able to recharge that supply within our landscape, either through the design of it, through the planting of trees that humidifies the air and attracts a higher level of rainfall in that region, or designing a system that is more in accordance with the climate of that particular region. So if the climate is quite a high rainfall, it would allow us to use more water within that system. Or if the climate has a very low rainfall, it would then restrict our design into choosing species that have low water requirements, so they don't need too much water to function. So we'll go through first how the water cycle works, and then we'll just touch upon some of those issues as we go through it. So the water cycle explains how water is made available in a fresh form within the biosphere to support life on Earth. So in the water cycle, you've got the movement of water through the different spheres of Earth, and it's that movement that allows it to be available in a fresh, continuous form to support the life that's on Earth. So initially you've got, it doesn't really start at any particular point, but if we just pick the evaporation to start with, so from oceans, lakes, rivers, any standing body of water, as it's heated by the sun, the water is going to change state from a liquid to a gas, and the gas is going to expand up into the atmosphere, where it will just continue to move around and collect up in the atmosphere until the atmosphere can't hold any more of it and it rains. So that movement of water as a gas from liquid water up into the air is called evaporation. And it's going to collect up into the atmosphere, and depending on the temperature, the atmosphere can hold more water in the atmosphere as it's warmer and less water in the atmosphere as it gets cooler. And what you often get is, as the air is moved by wind around in the atmosphere and it's pushed up against mountain ranges, the air is cooled as it's pushed up by the mountain ranges, and as it's cooled, the air can't hold on to so much water anymore, so the water will condense out of the air and form clouds and fall as rain. So you get particularly high rainfall around mountains where the air is getting pushed up and cooled. And in New Zealand you get that particularly on the west coast of New Zealand, so when our dominant wind is a westerly. So as those westerlies hit New Zealand and get pushed up by the mountains, as occurs on the west coast, particularly on the west side of the Southern Alps of the South Island, it will rain a lot in those areas. So in New Zealand we get a very high rainfall on our west coast because that's our dominant wind, and it's a lot drier on the east coast because there's a lot less wind coming from the easterly direction. So the condensation of water in the clouds, and then the precipitation of water in rain, and it's generally raining on mountains or areas where the land gets steeper. And within that catchment, the water is going to funnel down through that catchment, so it's going to be pulled down by gravity, and it's going to collect in streams and rivers where it then flows back as runoff down back into oceans and lakes. So some of the important points here, forgetting one. All right, we'll just tackle this and then we'll talk about transpiration, because transpiration is a little bit special. So just with that part of it that I just explained so far, so with the runoff, some of the important considerations is how pure and clean that water is. So it's the process of, as it falls on the mountains, it's in a perfectly pure and clean state. But because we want to be able to drink the water and use it within our agricultural systems, it's in these areas of land, as the waters move through those lands, that we want to make sure it's in a clean, clear state. And it's the movement of water through forested and living, biologically rich systems which is going to maintain the purity of that water and make sure it's in a state where you can still drink it. And unfortunately, with our current practices on the land, the water as it moves through that landscape is being contaminated by excessive levels of nutrients, through levels of fertilizer use or excessive concentrations of grazers, where the manures are entering into the water and collecting into streams and rivers, and it's leading to eutrophication, which is where the nutrient levels in the river or lake or whatever it is get too high, and it causes a bloom of algae. And that bloom of algae can result in everything getting covered in a yucky kind of green sludge, and that changes the habitat for the other living things that are in that river or lake, and they can no longer find homes under the stones or in the sand as they used to, because it's covered in a green sludge, and some of those algae can become toxic as well. So the contamination can impact the environment, but it can also impact our use of that water. So as it becomes contaminated, we are no longer able to drink it just straight from its source. We need to purify it and to make it safe to drink, and the same for use as livestock. We need to make sure that the water that we use is in a clean, fresh state for their best health as well. So there's two solutions to that. You either purify it, which is our current solution, or you design a system where as the water moves through it, it's not becoming contaminated, so you're not getting a negative impact on our health or our livestock health, and you're not getting a negative impact on the environment either. And obviously, you know, that's the best long-term solution, is to design a system that doesn't contaminate water in the first place, and then that keeps us and our environment healthier. So that's one of the main issues, and I was touching upon it earlier as well with the extraction of the groundwater to irrigate agricultural systems, and just how unsustainable that is, because it takes a long time for the water to percolate down through the soil into the groundwater, and that's why it's called fossil water, because it takes a long time to accumulate. So we need to make sure that we don't extract it at a rate that is greater than the rate at which it accumulates, and we're doing it many thousands of times faster than it will naturally accumulate, so we're using it at an unsustainable rate. Okay, so that's a little bit about, you know, the movement of water and its cleanliness as it moves through the landscape, and just how we can design in relationship to that to make sure it's kept nice and clean. And just to kind of pick out a couple of the different spheres as we go around. So we've got the hydrosphere, which is the lakes and rivers and the ocean. So the water's moving through that hydrosphere. It also includes the groundwater, and it's moving from the hydrosphere into the atmosphere as it evaporates, and then as it rains it can enter into the lithosphere. So as it moves through the catchment, as it moves through the layers of the soil, that is the movement of water through the lithosphere. And the last link is the biosphere, and that often acts as the stabilizing element with the movement of any molecule through all these systems of the earth, and it helps regulate the continuous supply of that particular nutrient or molecule, in this case water. So with the biosphere, you've got plant roots that are drawing up water from the ground, and they absorb that through their root hairs. So if you look at a plant, it's got a system of roots that are going down into the soil, and each of these roots have very fine root hairs on it. And those root hairs provide the roots with a big surface area for absorbing water and other nutrients out of the ground and drawing it up into the plant. And it's a process called, so water is absorbed by osmosis. And osmosis is just a process that describes the movement of water. So in the case of plants, what it does is it has a higher concentration of solutes, which are things that dissolve in water. So this is the root here. And there's lots of solutes in the root here, which is mostly sugars. And there's fewer solutes in the soil. So osmosis is the movement of water from an area where the water is less concentrated to an area where it's more concentrated. So the water is going to be drawn into the root here because there's more solutes in it. So this is it's a passive, it doesn't require any energy, but plants have evolved the ability to increase the concentration of solutes in their root hairs, and by doing that they draw the water out of the soil. It doesn't require any energy, it's just the water will always just move wherever the concentration of solutes is highest. And then once the water is absorbed into the plant, it will move up vessels, and these are called xylem vessels, so it will be drawn up the vessels. And it will be drawn up by two processes. One is capillary action, which is where water is attracted to the sides of a container or a vessel, and the thinner that tubing or vessel is, the more water is drawn up inside it. So if you have a look at the xylem vessel, water will be pulled up the sides of it by capillary action. And then as it moves up the stem and into the leaves, the other adaptation that plants have is an opening on the bottom of the leaves called a stomata. And it's through that opening that water will be lost by evaporation up into the atmosphere. And it's that loss of water loss of water through the stomata by evaporation that will draw the water up through the xylem vessel. So it's kind of like sucking on a straw. That's creating a negative pressure as you suck, and it's creating a negative pressure here too. And that negative pressure will help draw the water up through the xylem vessels. And that process is called transpiration. So the evaporation of water from the stomata is called transpiration. So if we look back at our diagram here, it's this transpiration is quite an important process with regulating the movement of water through these different spheres, and it's drawing water up through the lithosphere, so it's drawing it up from the soil, and it's moving through the biosphere and back into the atmosphere again. So it's the way that the biological systems have integrated into this movement of water through these spheres, and by doing that help regulate the availability of water. Because what happens when trees do this is they actually affect the local climate and the local rainfall. So most areas on Earth before humans came, well, a lot of them were covered in trees, and it's the ability of trees to transpire and to put water into the atmosphere help to regulate the rainfall in these areas, particularly areas close to the equator. So there's this kind of Mediterranean belt where it can be subject to low levels of rainfall in summer. So if you've got a low level of rainfall in summer and you've got a lot of sun evaporating those systems, if you take out those trees from that system, they can become deserts quite easily, because that system doesn't have a high rainfall anyway. And if you take out the trees that are creating that rainfall, then there will be even less rainfall, and then the whole system tends to collapse and transition into a desert. So a lot of the deserts that are on Earth were created by people. And the way this happened was that when trees were in these systems, the trees helped regulate the climate in those regions by transpiration. So they increased the level of rainfall in that particular area. And not only did they increase the level of rainfall, but by shading the ground and creating a living biological system within the soil fed by their root systems, when it did rain, the rain was held in the soil within that biologically rich soil. The trees shaded that soil, so reduced the amount of evaporation from that soil and helped stabilize that whole biological system and create a more thriving biological system there. But as soon as the trees were cut down, you cut out this moderating element that was helping to stabilize that system and keep it in a biologically rich state. And once you cut them down, the rainfall dropped dramatically, particularly in summer, where the evaporative water loss from the intense sun was the highest, and the ground was no longer shaded, so any water that did fall would evaporate quite quickly, and without being fed by this root system and the sugars that the trees were pumping out, the biological system also collapsed and shrunk away in the soil, particularly without the shading that trees provided. So the result of that is that the moderating element of having this tree system with their biologically rich system in the soil that they supported was a dramatic loss of water availability in that habitat, and they would often become deserts. So when we look at the geological history of a lot of areas like the Sahara and other famous deserts, when you look back 100,000 years into the past, you see that those systems were quite biologically rich environments, and we often relate that to changes in climate because where we kind of attribute this last Holocene, we call it, so this last period from the last ice age where people have flourished and expanded out throughout the world. We attribute the expansion of deserts to the changing climate associated with that Holocene period. But we don't necessarily relate it to the impact of people cutting down trees and turning those places into deserts. And you often see in these regions, before people started to occur in those areas, that they used to be flourishing, biologically rich systems, but then people came in, cut down a lot of trees, and they quickly reverted to desert. And in the Middle East region, where you've got quite a well-established history of people occupying those sites, you can see more dramatically how, as people arrived and they cut down the trees, how those systems collapsed and transitioned into arid or semi-arid or desert-like systems. And I guess one of the last important points with that is how the global warming that we associate with this last phase from the last ice age, called the Holocene, and it's called the Holocene because it's been impacted so severely by people. That whole period has actually been likely to be created by people. So as they cut down trees and they reduced the rainfall and they changed the pattern of rainfall around the world, we actually created this period of more warm climate that is associated with that Holocene. So we actually terraformed our planet in a little bit to better create conditions that favoured us, at least in some areas, with a warmer climate. And that supported the boom of our civilization, but in those areas that are more fragile and have a lower rainfall, it also led to those civilizations collapsing and moving to different areas. So there's lots of interesting background context to understanding this water cycle and the role it's had in the establishment of societies and its link to changing climates around the world. The carbon cycle is quite topical importance at the moment because of the threats of global warming associated with carbon dioxide being added to the atmosphere. So what we're doing at the moment, as far as global warming goes, is increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And if you have a look at the Earth, the way our atmosphere works is it acts as like a glass house. So there's radiation of heat from the sun, and that's quite high intensity heat. And as it hits the Earth and the oceans absorb that heat and they re-radiate it out. So this is re-radiated heat. And a lot of that heat is absorbed by the gas molecules that are in the atmosphere and re-scattered in all directions. So one of the components of heat is as it gets absorbed by living matter, and it speeds up the movement of that living matter, and then they re-radiate that heat out again. So all of these molecules in our atmosphere are re-radiating that heat in all directions, and that traps a lot of heat in the atmosphere. So the gases trap heat in our atmosphere. So if you increase the concentration of the gases in the atmosphere by increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide, for example, you also trap more heat. So you trap more heat and that warms up the atmosphere, warms up the earth, and there's problems associated with that due to different species being able to survive in different places. They could potentially migrate to different areas, but if that migration means that they are hitting human habitations and cities and townships, then they can't migrate as they would like to, and therefore they're trapped in areas that are changing in ways they don't like, and they can't evolve quickly enough to make those changes, so they go extinct. So one of the threats with global warming is that species will go extinct because their environment changes in ways that they can't evolve quickly enough to, and they can't migrate because of being trapped by human developments, so they go extinct. And there's changes in other systems. If the ice in the poles melts, the sea water rises, and that creates opportunities and threats. One of the threats it creates is it will flood a lot of our cities that are in close proximity to the coastline. So that's bad news for us. And I guess in a nutshell, the problem with global warming is that because we've established all of these resources and cities and towns, changes in the status quo threatens the stability of all of those constructions that we've made. So if we can't be dynamic and flexible in how we respond to changes in the environment, then we will suffer as a consequence of that. So one of the, that's the main threat of global warming, is changes in the environment that threaten wildlife and threaten us. And that's ties in with the carbon cycle, is that what causes the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is carbon being extracted from deposits in the soil, and that's deposits such as oil, gas and coal, and they were once living things. A lot of them were created in these deposits were largely created in the Carboniferous period. So there was a period of Earth's history where there was a great abundance of plants, and particularly in swampy areas, and they pumped out a lot of oxygen into the atmosphere, creating all these anomalies like giant insects because there was so much oxygen available in the atmosphere. But anyway, as all these plants died and decayed in these swampy environments, they were transformed. All the carbon that was in their body structures was being transformed over thousands of years into oil, gas and coal. And we're extracting that carbon out of those deposits, and we're burning it as fossil fuels, and we're putting it into the atmosphere, where it's going to increase the concentration of carbon dioxide and increase the ability of our atmosphere to trap and store heat, which will lead to global warming and changes in sea level and various threats to the biosphere. So the carbon cycle is the movement of carbon between the atmosphere as carbon dioxide into the biosphere. So that can happen as plants absorb carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and through photosynthesis transform that carbon dioxide into sugar, and then take those sugars and make them into proteins and fats and other carbohydrates that other living things can then eat, or they can use to construct their leaves and stems and other parts of themselves, into the biosphere through photosynthesis. Plants can then take those sugars that they make, put it into the soil as soil exudates to feed the microorganisms that they rely on to give them in exchange minerals. So that carbon can then go into the lithosphere, into the ground, so which can be put into the lithosphere as exudates, and when the plants die, as they decompose, and when the animals die. And as that ground erodes, the carbon that's in the ground can be eroded and be deposited into water, so it can enter into the hydrosphere. So erosion can move carbon into the hydrosphere. And the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere can also be absorbed into the oceans or lakes or other elements of the hydrosphere, so it can move from the atmosphere into the hydrosphere. So what you're getting here is this picture of how carbon can move between the different spheres of the Earth as it's changing type from one form to another. And how that's of primary importance to us is how it's associated with global warming as the concentration of the gases increase. But there's hope. There's a great thing we can do within our agricultural system is speed up the rates at which the carbon dioxide is being taken out of the atmosphere and being put into the soil as plant exudates. So we can speed up the process through intentional design, the rate at which plants are taking the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and putting it into the soil. And the great news is that the more carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere, and the warmer the Earth becomes because of global warming, the faster plants will grow and the faster plants will actually do this process for you. So it's one of the checks and balances that occur within the Earth to help maintain the levels of carbon within the atmosphere and the soil at pretty constant levels if we don't interfere with it too much. Okay, so the nitrogen cycle is another important cycle to just review and look at how nitrogen is moving between the different spheres, and again regulated by the interactions of the biosphere to help stabilize the recycling of nitrogen and make it available in fresh forms to support life on Earth. So with nitrogen, what's interesting is the atmosphere itself is actually 70% nitrogen, so in the state of NO3. And the major way it gets into the biological system is through the activity of mycorrhizal fungi that can fix nitrogen. So they have the ability to transform the atmospheric nitrogen into a water-soluble nitrate form. And they have evolved this ability in relationship to plants so that they can provide these nitrates to plants in exchange for the sugars that plants can produce through photosynthesis and release as exudates through their roots. So the bacteria can't photosynthesize, so they've created this beneficial relationship with the plants where they take the sugars in exchange for the nitrates that they provide to the plants. So once it's in the plants, it's in a biologically active state that it can be transferred to other animals through the food chain through consumption. The plants themselves use it to produce proteins. So when you look at the structure of any protein, a protein is made of amino acids, and each amino acid has an important nitrate group as part of that molecule. So to make those amino acids and therefore make those proteins, you need the nitrates to be able to do that. So that's why it's such an important part, such an important element to have to promote plant growth and to support the rest of the food chain, is because without nitrates you can't make proteins, and proteins are the things that drive all the systems in your body. So they're the things that make the cells function, they're the things that create your tissues and drive the cellular processes in your body. So they're very important, and you probably all heard of how DNA is important. DNA is just a code to make proteins. So the thing that does all these magical processes in your body are all proteins, and DNA is just the code to make those proteins. So it's important stuff. So Once it's got from the atmosphere into the biosphere by these nitrogen fixating bacteria, and that can happen two ways as well. So it can return back into the atmosphere through denitrifying bacteria, so they can return it back into the atmosphere again and help maintain that balance of nitrogen in the biosphere and in the atmosphere. But once it's in the biosphere, it can then be transferred through consumption to herbivores, such as this great looking sheep here, or other herbivores, and those herbivores can in turn be eaten by carnivores or omnivores and be transferred through the food chain. And each of those animals, which are all consumers because they're all eating other animals or plants, they all use those proteins that they consume to make their own bodies. So when you eat something, so when we eat something or a sheep eats it, we break down those proteins back into those amino acids again, and then we use those amino acids to make our own proteins. And some things like plants can get all the amino acids, some things like herbivores, so like sheep, can get all of the amino acids they need from plants, and other things like predators and some omnivores need to get their amino acids from plants and animals to make their own proteins. Okay, so that's how it's been moving through the biosphere, and some of those nitrates can also be leached into the hydrosphere. So because the nitrates are water soluble, they dissolve in water very easily, and that's important because plants couldn't absorb them through their roots if they weren't water soluble. But because they're water soluble, they also get absorbed into the water and move wherever the water goes. And in a biological system, you can make use of that. So you can design a system that catches the water and distributes it into a series of ponds and dams and aquaponic systems, and makes use of the nutrients, including nitrates, that are in the water to drive those biological systems. But when the nitrates are in excess in the environment, so there's too much of them, they can pollute the aquatic systems, and they can lead to eutrophication, so the build-up of algae and the changing of habitat and algae blooms related to the pollution of those environments. So that's how the nitrates can move into the hydrosphere, just by being absorbed into the water and moving wherever the water goes. And that's why aquatic systems are so fertile and so productive, is because all the nutrients that are important for biological systems, they are all water soluble, so so water tends to collect those nutrients, so that makes them very productive systems. It can also go into the, got a wrong label here, so this should be the geosphere. So the geosphere is the Earth. So nitrates, being water soluble, don't tend to store very well in soil, so that's why they're often a limiting factor to plant growth, because the soil doesn't tend to hold them very well. But if you've got aggregates in your soil, so if you've got biological systems working to develop the soil structure and create these aggregates, and we'll go into that in the soil module, how they do that. But these aggregates help hold on to the nutrients that are in the soil, so they act as a slow release store of these nitrates and other nutrients back into the soil when fungi and bacteria break down those aggregates again. So one way in which nitrates can be stored in the soil is by having a biologically rich system that creates soil aggregates, and that helps store those nutrients in the soil. So nitrates can also be kind of transferred from the terrestrial, so the land-based systems, into the earth-based biological systems by manures and dead animals. So when there's manure and dead animals on the ground, the soil microbiology can break them down and draw them into the soil microbiology, and that acts as a food source to support all of the amazing life that's in the soil, and they in turn can store it in the geosphere as aggregates. Or it can be returned back into the atmosphere by oxidization. So if you get plants just dying on the surface, for example, most of the nitrates will oxidize back into atmospheric nitrogen and be lost back into the nitrogen. But if you get a herbivore, say, eating a plant and changing it into a manure, it pre-digests it and it coats it with all the beneficial bacteria within its digestive system, and it creates a product that will better feed the soil life and draw those nitrates back into the soil. So the life processes in the biological systems of things eating each other help store these nutrients in the biological systems as they eat each other, and also store it in the biological systems of the soil, which can then store it in the soil as aggregates. So it's the function of these consumption events within the biological systems that help store these nutrients in those biological systems and help support the greater complexity and diversity of life. So life kind of begets more life. The more rich and diverse those biological systems are, the more productive, more resilient, more diverse they can become. So that's quite an important point with what we can do within our own agricultural systems. If we make our own agricultural systems more diverse and abundant, they become more resilient, they become more stable, and they become more productive because the nutrients have more ability to be stored and transmitted within those systems and stored in there as a pool of resources to support the products that you extract from that agricultural system. So that's the nitrogen cycle, and just looking at how the water, carbon and nitrates are recycled within the within all the spheres, but how the biological systems help stabilize it is quite an important aspect to understanding this whole ecological system topic, and how if we make our agricultural systems more diverse and interconnected, we help establish more abundance and resiliency within those systems, because there's more interactive events that help produce products within those systems. So it's an important aspect to making them more productive.